Egyptian officials say mediators have made progress in talks aimed at a truce in Gaza. Representatives from the US, Egypt, Israel and Qatar are meeting in Cairo as international calls grow for Israel to put off a planned assault on the southern city of Rafah. More than 1 million civilians are crammed into Rafah. Many fled there from Israeli attacks in other parts of the Gaza Strip. Israel, meanwhile, says Rafah is the last bastion of Hamas, the militant group that committed the October the 7th terror attacks. Aid agencies are saying the people in Rafah would have nowhere to go if an Israeli ground attack took place. On Monday, US President Joe Biden said Washington was working on a deal to release Israeli hostages and bring what he called immediate and sustained calm to Gaza for at least 6 weeks.
Partnership between the United States and our allies.
Now, according to Gaza's health ministry, which is run by Hamas, more than 28,000 Palestinians have died in the violence so far. And currently, for the living, there are no good options.
Their few remaining possessions are packed. The road to an uncertain future lies ahead. This is the reality for hundreds of thousands of Gazan refugees in their desperate search for safety.
We hope the war ends and ends quickly. We're tired of fleeing from one city to another. We're so tired, I swear to God. People are tired. I'm hoping the world stands with us and looks at us with a kind and merciful eye. We're tired. We're always crying. Martyrs, shelling, destruction, death, starvation, thirst. There's no food.
Some 1.3 million Gazans had found respite from the fighting here in Rafah following Israel's orders. But Israel's planned offensive in the city threatens what little safety Rafah can provide. There are few options available to the people living in Rafah. They could travel north to central Gaza, al-Mawasi, or Khan Yunis. But heavy fighting has much of those areas in ruins. Leaving civilians like these faced with a desperate choice.
There simply is no place to flee to. Central and northern Gaza have been the sites of increased and intense fighting. Northern Gaza has been basically reduced to rubble. There are no facilities or accommodations there able to host people fleeing for safety. On top of that, there's the added risk of unexploded ordnances throughout all of Gaza, but particularly in the north, where there was quite heavy airstrikes early on in the first few months of this escalation. And on top of that, people have fled multiple times. They have nothing with that, nothing. They have very little belongings.
The United States, the European Union, and the United Nations have urged the IDF to do more to protect civilians caught up in the fighting. But as Rafah comes under increasing fire, it remains unclear if anywhere is safe for the people of Gaza.
Nawaf bin Mubarak Al-Thani is a lecturer in the field of international relations and defence. He's also a former director of defence intelligence operations in Qatar. I asked him to tell us where the truce talks stand right now.
Well, from the reports, what we can say, Anya, is that the talks are progressing positively, and hopefully we can see results soon. Unfortunately, however, there is actions on the other direction happening from the IDF that may threaten any advance in those talks, especially in regards to Rafah.
Okay. What are some of the major gaps that still need to be bridged right now in these negotiations?
Well, obviously, the escalatory scene right now, from a military standpoint, has to be addressed. The current situation in Rafah is untenable. It is right now the last place where refugees have some sort of calm, relative, obviously. It's been shattered right now with the bombings, and the fear of a land incursion just may threaten all of that. So that situation right now in Rafah looms over all negotiations that one might expect, obviously.
Israel is facing huge international criticism, even from its main ally, the US. Is the fact that the CIA chief is now also at the negotiating table, is that key to making Israel accept a deal?
Well, this is not the first time for the Director of Central Intelligence to be part of the negotiation. This has been a standing situation where the Director of Central Intelligence was always part of the negotiation. However, the rhetoric from the US's side has ramped up. Last week, we saw from the National Security Council in the White House directives for any country receiving military aid to adhere to humanitarian international law. That is a new advance in a persuasion, if you will, if not pressure, for the Israelis to back down from further escalation militarily. So I think that is where we're going, and the Americans have done a lot. They could do more, obviously. But we're coming to a head right now where there are two escalatory situations happening from the air and probably the second from the ground soon that may threaten that delicate balance we have right now in the 11th hour of negotiations.
Hamas officials are clear. They say any major attack on Rafah will lead to an end of any further negotiations. Do you see any signs that Israel is listening, is taking this warning seriously?
Well, to be honest, the European Union, not only Hamas, but the European Union, Great Britain, the United States, Qatar and Egypt, and most of Israel's partners, allies, and obviously the negotiators have advised Israel and warned Israel to not advance into Rafah. The Israelis have not shown any signal that they're backing down. Now, they may do that, but they haven't signaled as much. The current kinetic operations are advancing. The devastation is continuing, unfortunately. And with this new escalation today of killing journalists and wounding journalists, today two journalists were wounded from Al Jazeera. In the past 48 hours, 4 journalists were killed. It doesn't send a good message that the Israelis are not planning to move forward with the invasion of Rafah, unfortunately. However, the US and the EU still have pressure points. We've seen it in the past, and hopefully it will continue to convey the idea that both war and peace cannot exist at the same time.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Nawaf bin Mubarak Al-Thani, thank you so much for your time and your analysis there.
Thank you very much, Anna.
The situation in Rafah was on the agenda today in Berlin, where Germany's Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock met her Palestinian counterpart Riad al-Malki for talks. Here's what she had to say.
We've seen hundreds of thousands of people lose their homes in the past months. Of course they need shelter. They went to the south, where there were already several refugee camps. That's why we made it clear that the over 1 million people in the area can't just disappear into thin air. They need safe corridors to get to safety, like they did in the beginning. And that is our responsibility. I've made it as clear as possible. There cannot just be safe places and corridors in theory. They have to exist in reality.
Sichere Orte, Schutzkorridore geben muss, sondern auch in der Realität.
Our chief political correspondent, Nina Haase, elicited that response from the German Foreign Minister. Tell us more about the meeting, Nina.
Well, it's not the first time, of course, that Annalena Baerbock and Riad al-Malki have met. Annalena Baerbock has been to the region 4 times since the 7th of October, when Hamas, the terrorist organization, launched this brutal attack on Israel. So Riad al-Malki thanked her for her efforts in trying to exercise essentially a bit of pressure on both sides so that this conflict ends. Annalena Baerbock's message is always there is suffering suffering on all sides. So she does mention that there are still more than 100 hostages that are being kept by Hamas, and that Israel does have the right to defend itself against that sort of terrorism. But at the same time, she says nobody can overlook the suffering that is going on in Gaza. And today at this meeting, she reiterated again, Israel does have the right to defend itself, but it does not have the right to expel anybody from essentially what is Palestinian territory. And both foreign ministers expressed their big concern over an escalation of the situation in Rafah, which is why they stress so much that there need to be safe corridors for the people who have fled to the south of Gaza, exactly because there was this big military operation in the north of Gaza. We all know that there is no option for the Palestinians to flee further south. Egypt is not willing to take refugees in from the Gaza Strip. So there need to be safe corridors, and Annalena Baerbock is going to tell the Israeli counterparts she's going to be meeting again later on this week that they need to make sure that a humanitarian disaster is avoided.
You mentioned the day after this conflict and also Baerbock's upcoming trip to Israel again. Did the meeting touch on what the future could look like for Gaza?
Absolutely. There are lots of negotiations happening behind closed doors at the moment. Qatar is an important player. Egypt is an important player, the United States, but also Germany, which is still one of Israel's closest allies. And yet, Annalena Baerbock stressed that there are certain conditions that Israel also needs to fulfill. Riad al-Malki also said that reforms of the Palestinian Authority, of which he's the head, are vital so that the Palestinian population essentially has a legitimate representation again. We mustn't forget that, of course, Riad al-Malki doesn't represent Hamas. He represents the Palestinian Authority that is based in Ramallah. So there needs to be a proper representation of the Palestinian people. He said that that is very much in his interest because they all say this conflict cannot be solved militarily. What is needed is a political solution, and that essentially a two-state solution is the only way forward, and that these preparations need to happen at the same time. Riad al-Malki was being very clear. He wants Germany to put pressure on Israel so that Israel also sees the right of the Palestinian people to have their own state.
Interesting insights there from our chief political correspondent, Nina Haase.